My name is Yossi Klein Halevi, and it's wonderful to be here with so many friends, old friends, new friends, and some very, very dear friends. The settlement movement is going to be celebrating its 50th anniversary this September. Erev Rosh Hashanah, 1967, barely 3 months after the Six-Day War, the first settlement was founded, or rather refounded. Does anyone know the name of the first settlement? This is a quiz. Kfar Etzion. And Kfar Etzion was a kibbutz, a religious kibbutz, that was destroyed literally on the eve of Israel's Declaration of Independence. It was on May 13th, 1948. Its defenders surrendered to the Arab militias of the area and were massacred. And that was one of the great traumas of the founding of the state, the destruction of Kfar Etzion. With the Six-Day War, a group of children of the original kibbutz met with Prime Minister Levi Eshkol and asked him for permission to return to the original area. And they said to him, Rosh Hashanah is approaching, and we would like your permission to go there and pray, meaning with the intention of staying. And Eshkol, who preferred to speak in Yiddish, said to them, Nu kinderlach, nu children, if you want to go pray, go pray. And that is how the first settlement was founded, without a cabinet meeting, without any formal decision. And 6 months later, Pesach, 1968, a group of Israelis pretending to be Swiss tourists booked a Palestinian hotel in Hebron, the Park Hotel, and booked it for the holiday. And when Pesach was over, they announced their intention of remaining and of reestablishing the Jewish presence in Hebron, which had been destroyed in the pogrom of 1929. Now, I'm emphasizing this aspect of reestablishment because it strikes me as not coincidental that the first two settlements that were founded were both reconstructions of destroyed communities that had existed within the living memory of many Israelis, which is to say that the initial impetus for the settlement movement was not only a return to the longing, not only a longing to return to the biblical lands, but there was an organic connection within the living memory of the Yishuv, of the pre-state Jewish community. And I think that goes a long way to understanding how the settlement movement was established, how initially it was far less controversial than it is today, certainly the founding of Kfar Etzion. And so as we approach the 50th anniversary with the very loaded emotions to one side or another with which the Jewish people will be approaching this event, I think it's worthwhile going back to that original moment and just reflect on what happened and why. We are privileged tonight to have with us a range of opinions, of experiences coming out of the settlement movement. And it often seems to me that the only group that one is permitted, even expected in certain circles, to make sweeping generalizations about are the settlers. And so what I hope we'll do tonight is to unpack that solid, non-distinguishable mass, and to hear some nuance, perhaps some disagreements, and certainly very varied experiences. To my left is Sara Haetzni-Cohen. Sara grew up in Kiryat Arba and is the granddaughter of one of the founders of the Jewish community in Hebron and Kiryat Arba, Eliakim Haetzni, a legendary figure in the settlement movement. And she is chair of My Israel, which is the largest pro-settlement presence on the internet. And under her tutelage, the organization has shifted its focus in fighting BDS and has turned that into its top priority. She is studying for her master's degree in public management and currently lives in Jerusalem. To my immediate right is Rabbi Yaakov Nagen, ordained at Yeshiva University and a leading figure in interfaith encounters, especially between Muslims and Jews. He recently paid I believe, an unannounced visit to Al-Azhar in Cairo. Perhaps he'll tell us a little bit about that. He has lived in Otniel, the settlement of Otniel, for the last 20 years. His books include Nishmat HaMishnah, a window to the inner world of the Mishnah. And finally, to my farthest right, Oded Revivi, the mayor of Efrat, now in his second term. And under Oded's terms, the population of Efrat has grown by 60%. Oded began his career as a lawyer, and he is a former lieutenant colonel in the Armored Corps Reserves. So we're going to ask each of our distinguished panelists to spend 10 minutes, to take 10 minutes for an opening statement. I will then ask a few questions, and then we'll turn it over to all of you. So, Oded, you begin.
Okay, so good evening. Thank you very much for the introduction. It's extremely interesting, fascinating, exciting to see such a lively audience at the end of the week at such a late hour, and I'll try and do the best to entertain you in the given time that we have. I think taking your introduction, Yaakov, and trying to map the different sectors, it's important to know where I came from and maybe on that show a light as to who are the settlers. I personally grew up in Jerusalem, got married in 1993, didn't have enough money to buy property in Jerusalem, could afford buying a house in Efrat. It seemed like a very reasonable investment, a suburb of Jerusalem, 15 minutes south of Jerusalem, door to door every morning, 20 minutes. And that's how we ended up in Efrat with my wife Lisa and our 6 kids. And when you look at who are the people who crossed the green line to live in Judea and Samaria, so there are 3 major bulks. The largest bulk, which is a third, growing into a half, are ultra-Orthodox Jews, who've basically come from areas like Mea Shearim and Bnei Brak, which you're all familiar with, coming from families of an average of 12 kids per family. There wasn't enough property to supply for all the newlyweds, and the government basically planned cities to accommodate their religious belief. They're mainly living in places like Beitar Elit, Modi'in Elit, Immanuel, and when I say to accommodate their religious belief, the details go as far as if they rely on the halachic permit to drive on an elevator on Shabbat, so the apartment blocks will be more than 3 stories, and if they don't, they won't be more than 3 stories. Needless to say, all the apartments have balconies for sukkah, all the kitchens have 2 sinks, but if you go in there, you really feel as if you're going into Mea Shearim or Bnei Brak. Those are the type of people who live there. They're a third, growing into half, because the rate that they are having kids hasn't dropped, and basically they're just growing and growing communities. My peer, the mayor of Beitar, when you ask him how many residents live in Beitar, he will say 60,000, 60,001, 60,002. And the pace is of 2 newborn classes every single week. The second third, which is shrinking into a quarter, are secular Jews, mainly living in places like Ariel, Ma'ale Domim, the settlements on the border of the Green Line, Har Adar, Bet Aryeh, places like that. Usually people, again, who were looking for quality of life, looking to live in a suburb of major working areas, and that's how they ended up crossing the Green Line. Only the last third will comply to the stereotype that I think some of you might be holding, which is modern Orthodox Jews. And even within that part, there's a big variety of people and the reasoning that they've moved over. So there are, of course, the founders of the settlement movement, the grandparents of Sara, and the people who were in that crowd, who were either driven because they were there before, like Hanan Porat. He was one of the orphans of the Gush Etzion battle. He was one of the kids that was evacuated during the battle over Gush Etzion with the women and other children, and the men were left to protect the property over the battle. And those are the Kinderlach that came and said, we want to go back to the property of our parents. There are those who came there because of biblical belief and biblical ideology and understanding that Judea and Samaria is covered with historical biblical sites and wanting to come and live there. And there are those like Oded who've moved there basically because of financial reasons. What has happened during the Obama administration is that all these 3 groups all of a sudden were being put in one basket. If prior to the Obama administration there was some sort of separation between those who are Haredim, because for a very long period of time they were treated differently because they maintained the political coalition that there was in order to carry on having a peace treaty, agreement, process. There were those who were living in remote settlements, and there were those who were living in blocks. And as Prime Minister Netanyahu says, when President Obama said not one more brick, meaning not one more brick anywhere, all of a sudden all the different groups that compose the group which is called settlers were basically bond in a very strong bond that hasn't come apart up until now. Efrat is a city of 10,000 residents growing into 16,000. 90% of them are religious, 10% of them are secular. The founder of the city, one of the 2 founders, is Rav Shlomo Riskin, which basically gave guidelines and some sort of desire to plan a city which is not surrounded by a fence. And when they came to plan that city, and if any of you have ever visited Efrat, it's a very unique city in its geographical meaning. From one end to another, it's 5.5 miles. The width of it is no more than a traffic circle at the most narrowest place. And those who founded the city had a vision of building a city which is not surrounded by a fence. And when you try and think of the challenges which a mayor faces besides providing water, collecting sewage, public transportation, where do you put educational systems, supermarkets, shopping centers, you also have to think of the security issue. And the idea was planning a city which is not surrounded by a fence was to try and plan and build a city that there will be no need to surround it by a fence. And the idea was, and this is after the American election, so I can go back to my old terminology, believing in building bridges and not building walls or building fences. And 34 years later, Efrat is still not surrounded with a fence. We still enjoy a very good relationship with our Arab neighbors. The peak of them are 2 occasions when we have a phone call in the middle of the night from the head of Wadi Nis, one of the 3 neighboring villages, that says, we see some suspicious movement, and sure enough, because of their awareness, we went out and we saw it was terrorists who wanted to do a terrorist attack, which we stopped in due course because of our Arab neighbors. I think this is where I'll stop, so I won't go over my time and go and get annoyed with the MC. And if you have any questions, I'll be more than happy to address later.
Toda rabah.
Hi. Thank you for being here. My name is Sara Haetzni-Cohen, and I'm a mother of 3 beautiful kids. So you introduced me very well, but you forgot the most important thing. And I now live in Jerusalem, and I lived all my life in Kiryat Arba. How many of you have been in Kiryat Arba? Oh, a lot. I'm not sure if you're Israelis. I'm not sure if I asked this question. I suppose it was less hands in the air. So I live in Kiryat Arba. It's a small town settlement of around 8,000 people, and it's next to Hebron. We're neighbors. My grandfather, Eliakim, he ran away with his family from Germany in 1938 after Kristallnacht. Instead of going to North America or somewhere else, they chose to come here to the land of Israel because they were Zionists, non-religious. His mom was religious, but okay, he's not. And they chose to come here to the land of Israel before there was the state of Israel. He fought in the Palmach and in Haganah, and afterwards in the IDF. He got injured a few times. And after they were in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, and after the 6-day war, after Israel physically came back to our ancestors' land, to the biblical land, he decided he wants to continue the Zionist move that his parents did in moving to the land of Israel, and to continue this Zionist move with coming back to the city of Hebron, the ancient city of Hebron. There was 400 years Jews in Hebron up until 1929. There were, sorry? And in the year of 1929, in a pogrom, they were murdered around, if I remember, it's 65 or 67 Jews, and they didn't come back there up until 1968. And this was his mission. He believed in it. It wasn't a comfortable thing to go to take your children, your wife from your comfortable, convenient life in Tel Aviv and move to Hebron. But he did it because he believed in it. And I grew up. I was born there. I didn't choose it, but I'm happy I had the luck to be there and to grow up in this complicated environment, because we are a non-religious family. And most of the settlers, most of the residents of Kiryat Arba are religious. Maybe I meant to be religious because my husband is religious, so I don't know. I grew up in this environment of non-religious girl in a major of religious people, and this was one level in my life. The other level was the ideological and the security level of living in Kiryat Arba, because I went through the first Intifada and the second Intifada. The first Intifada is a girl. When people my relatives from Tel Aviv stopped coming to my birthday because it was too dangerous. I was born in 1983, and the first Intifada started at the end of the 80s, and suddenly nobody is coming to celebrate with me. Well, sounds, yeah, no worries, I'm a happy person. But this is the experience I had. And suddenly we replaced the windows of our car from glass to plastic. Actually, this weekend I'm going with my family to my parents in Kiryat Arba. We can't go in our car. We have to go in a car with plastic windows, because if not, it's a life risk. So it's a procedure. I mean, I need to change cars, and with three little kids, it's not that comfortable, but we do it. And I went through the second Intifada as a teenager. I learned in Jerusalem. I studied here in Jerusalem in a non-religious school. There were only religious schools in Kiryat Arba, and I didn't want to study in a ulpana for girls or in a religious school. So I went to a non-religious school in Jerusalem. That means I went for an hour long every day, back and forth. And suddenly the windows of the bus, they changed. They weren't changed from glass to plastic. They changed from plastic to armed. I felt like in an aquarium, because the second Intifada was much worse than the first Intifada. Not only stones and rocks, but shooting. And I finished school, and I went to the army, and everything is, you see, I'm here now. I know that some of you, who's Rabbi Kessler, right? No, yeah, Kessler. You. So I read the article in Haaretz, and I know you've been in Hebron. And one of the things that harm my heart the most is the image of Hebron. Because I know what they feed you when you go on Hebron, and I know what you see when you go on Hebron. And this is that's the city I grew up in. That's my childhood. That's my life. That's my family. That's my friends. Some of them were my friends because they were harmed in terror attacks. And one of the things that harm me a lot is the image of Hebron. Because I feel and I know that people get the wrong image of Hebron out of politics interest. Because, and I read, some I don't know, some friends sent me the article in the Haaretz, and I read it and I said, how? I think it's the group I'm going to speak with. And so I said, okay, maybe there's a chance. I cannot take you to a tour in Hebron now. I cannot show you where I grew up, but I can definitely give you some information that I'm not sure you were told. Because every corner in Hebron is so complicated and so not simple that it builds a wrong image when you put it flat. And every corner of Hebron, I know that Hebron is not a nice reality. Okay, I know, even not for me, and even not for an Israeli. So of course, not to someone who's not from Israel and not, I don't know, some of you maybe been in the army, but I assume most of you didn't. And it's complicated even for me that I grew up there. But I know the history, and I know the context, and I know the baby that was murdered there in 2001. And I know her family. And I know why the stores are empty. And I grew up when Baruch Goldstein murdered in the mosque, in the Me'arat HaMachpelah. And it's a horrible thing. Don't think that most of Kiryat Arba settlers, residents, hate it. They don't think it was a positive thing. Mamash lo. And I lived the time after Baruch Goldstein. The time that when we couldn't go on roads without a soldier being in our bus because the terror went this high. So one of the things that harm me the most is the image of Hebron, because it's so complicated and it's so not simple, and some people, some organization with a political interest, they want to show you the reality from one angle. That's okay. That's their job. They're doing it very well. But that's not the truth. The truth is that for me, as a resident of Hebron, I cannot go on Hebron. I can go only in two streets. The Shuhada Street. It's 3% of the city. 3%. For the rest, 97% of the city, I cannot go there. I cannot enter there because my kids won't have a mom. Because Israelis, it's a life risk for them to get inside there. You won't hear from me simple answers. Hebron is complicated. Hebron is not nice. There is a tense between the Jewish community and the Arab community there. But complicated is the word, not apartheid, not genocide, not any other word you hear. Complicated is the word. And 2 more minutes. 1 year ago, I started a journey to ask myself, how do I, as a very strong believer of the settlement movement and the whole Israel, how do I explain myself the future? Because I have 3 kids, hopefully more, but I see my future here. And I think that the state of Israel is a miracle. And we have to hold it very strong because the question today is not 67. You go on campuses, I assume. You know that the BDS movement is not 67. It's 48. The only country in the world that has a huge question mark upon its head is Israel. Upon its existence. And but I see my future here, and I believe we have to hold this miracle very strong. If we need to fight, we'll fight. And but we want to live, and we will live. And I asked myself, how do I see the future of the conflict? And I wanted to ask smarter people than me. I wanted to ask my grandfather, for example, and I wanted to ask a few more people, what is their solution to the conflict? Because, you know, there is no, it's a lot of mess here. And I won't be very long about it, but I did a project with Makor Rishon newspaper, and I interviewed some people because I believe that the two-state solution is not only a very dangerous solution, it's not practical. There are 400,000 settlers around the Judea and Samaria, West Bank, use your word. 150,000 approximately outside of the settlement blocks. Nobody really knows what are the settlement blocks. It's very flexible. But around 150,000 people. You cannot uproot them from their house. You can't. It's immoral. And they won't move. Israel moved 8,000 settlers from their houses in 2005. It was a huge crisis, a huge crisis. So now take this 8,000 to 150,000. And I will just tell you that I won't give you all of the solutions I have. I can send it to you and you can read it. Haaretz did and follow up to the project. But the answers are not simple, and that they are not mathematical. And they are not black and white. They are not black and white. It's not either one state or two state. There are a lot of gray in the middle. But I'm a believer, and I see my future here and my children's future here. And I believe that we can continue living in a complex reality and still live and let our neighbors live. And just remember that we are in the middle of the Middle East. We're not in Switzerland.
Toda rabba.
Welcome to Israel. In the course of my interfaith work, I spent a lot of time with Muslims, Christians, Buddhists, Sikhs, Shintos, but ironically, I spent not too much time with my brothers and Jewish brothers and sisters of other denominations. So I'm grateful for the opportunity to meet many rabbis, Reform and conservative rabbis. I grew up in the west side of Manhattan, and for the last 20 years, I've been living in Otniel with Michal and our 7 children. At a Jewish wedding, there are 7 blessings, Sheva Brachot, so me and Michal renew words every day. My life work is primarily in the yeshiva. There's a yeshivat Hesder with several hundred students in Otniel. Hesder is a program that combines study in yeshiva with army service. And similarly, my wife, Michal, is the founder of Israel's first in Hebrew, Mechina Kedam Tzva'it, pre-military academy for religious women. They're opening their 3rd branch next year. So, and deals a lot with issues of gender in the army. In our yeshiva, major focus is openness in many different areas, in particularly the interfaith. A major figure in the yeshiva was Rabbi Menachem Fruman, who was one of the founders of the interfaith movements in Israel, and his great insight is that if religion is so much the problem in the Middle East, it'll also have to be part of the solution. So my work incorporates many of our students. Just this afternoon, we said goodbye to a group of pastors from China, Malaysia, and Taiwan that spent several days studying in the yeshiva. We've had many Muslim speakers, whether from Egypt, Hebron, speak to us. In fact, my trip to Al-Azhar University was because a friend of mine, Egyptian friend of mine, who 3 years in a row came to Otniel to give lectures, asked me to pay a return visit. Relating to the issues at hand, within the vision that inspired Jews for centuries certainly include the return of the Jewish people to the land of Israel, but this is not the end of the story, but it's the beginning. And that same vision includes other components of that context of return includes the healing of the relationships of the Jewish people with humanity. And I see part of Zionism, if Zionism is a fulfillment of those visions, it must include also the return of the Jewish people to the land of Israel, but also that healing of our relationship with the rest of the world. And therefore, I feel it's not only a security issue or a practical issue, but a religious imperative to work on these connections. And sometimes people ask me that there are so many internal problems within the Jewish people, so maybe let's wait till stage 2 to deal with our relationship to the world. But so much of our internal problems relate to this issue, whether between right and left, religious and secular. The question about what is our place in humanity is fundamental. Going back to Rav Fruman's insight about if religion is part of the problem, it'll have to be part of the solution, meaning that our religious beliefs, belief in God or ethnic identities, they could separate us, but they could also connect us. The challenge is how to make that switch. And I think that the issue is not theology. The theology is simple. Whether if the 2 major parties in the conflict are Judaism and Islam, there is mutual respect, whether in the Quran, who sees Judaism as Ahlul Kitab, the people of the book, or the respect for the monotheism of Islam within Judaism. The question is taking the abstract ideas and making that something into a living reality. And in that nutshell, I'd say the issue is not the theology, but the real human encounters. When people meet, three things happen. When they meet in terms of not a chance meeting, but a meeting from within their identity. The first thing that could happen is the obvious is people might change what they think about the other. But I think no less significant is many truths that you have in your head become realities inside of your heart. And when you really pray together with Muslims, with other members of Abrahamic religions, you don't only know in your head, but you know in your heart that it's the same God we love, we pray to, and love us. And third, I'd say that when people meet, something new is created. You can't see it, but the relationship between the people who have met, that's, if to quote the little prince, that which is essential is hidden from the eye. And in that context, he's talking about the invisible connections of the relationships that are built up. Sometimes people ask that if I believe that these many meetings and encounters could really solve the problems in the Middle East, but I don't know about the big question, but sometimes I feel that, I believe is that when two people are connected, that already is shalom. We want to multiply that by millions, but it's not only a means to an end, but it's a value in itself, the connection between different people. Since I imagine many of the questions relate to political ideas and the like, the time left to me, I'll share some stories. Maybe one getting back to a story relating to Hebron, and if you have time for two stories, I'll do that also, but you'll let me know. A friend of mine who's the head of a large chamula in Hebron, for his protection I won't mention his name, once asked me to write a letter to the Machat of Hebron. The Machat is the commander of the Israeli forces in the Jewish part of Hebron. The day he asked me to write the letter was the day that my son was sworn into the Israeli army. My son served in Givati, and we were told that after they're finished their training, he will serve in Hebron. So I wrote to the Yeriv, who was then the Machat of Hebron. I told him that tonight was the the swearing in of my son. And since he entered the army, every Shabbat, I give him the bracha that he should tachzor b'shalom v'tachzor ima shalom. He should return in peace and with the peace. Said he will be one of your soldiers, and you are responsible for peace in Hebron for all its inhabitants. And know that we have many partners also on the Palestinian side. I spoke about some of my friends in the Arab part of Hebron. I sent a copy of the letter also to my friend, but I didn't think he knew how to read Hebrew. So I was surprised that the next day he called me and told me that myself and my friends are praying for Hillel and all to leave Hebron in peace. Several months later was Ramadan, and I was at a iftar held by Rav Yoel Schwartz, who's one of the leaders, a very prominent Haredi rabbi, who, together with some sheikhs from the city of Ramallah. And during the iftar is the meal at the end of each day in Ramadan. During the meal, the dialogue was so moving that the translator broke out crying. And she was quite embarrassed. And that night, I gave her a ride back to Hebron. She lived in the Hebron, the Arab part. And and in the car, she said, "Do you remember the letter that you wrote to so-and-so?" Yeah, I said, "Of course." She said, when he got the letter, he said he wants to understand every word of the letter. So I sat there translating every word. And the way I cried tonight, he cried when I read him the letter. And I'll mention that with this positive energy, unfortunately, the town I live, I think for the size, has been the hardest hit by terrorism of any place in Israel. Years ago, within the yeshiva that I teach, on Friday night, terrorists came in and murdered 4 of our students. And just in the last 2 years, last week was a year to the terrorist attack in which my neighbor, 2 houses from me, my neighbor, friend, and employer, Mickey Mark, was murdered on the road near Otniel. His wife left in critical brain injuries, and now the 10 children pretty much take care of each other. 3 houses from me lives my friend who actually brought me to Otniel, Yehuda Glick. He's now a member of Knesset, but he barely survived a assassination attempt because his belief in freedom of prayer on the Temple Mount. And to mention how stereotypes are so misleading, in Knesset, Yehuda founded the first caucus for for bettering Jewish-Muslim relations. He spearheaded the attempts to stop the law for the muezzin, a law that would curtail the sounds, of the muezzin that people found disturbing. But he felt this is something that should come from dialogue and not from legislation. And he's written enthusiastically about Al-Aqsa Mosque as a fulfillment of the vision of Isaiah of nations of humanity praying on the Temple Mount. And finally, 4 houses from us is another very close friend of ours, Daphne Meir, who was murdered a little more than a year ago in the house by a young man from Yatta who said he was enraged by things he saw on television. And my wife, with all her projects with the Mechina, would spend her time checking her Daphne's children's ears for lice because there was no one else to do it. So I have the positive view of things, but in terms of seeing the complexities, the dangers of the situation, I find myself in the heart of both parts.
Toda rabba, and thank you, all 3 of you. I especially appreciated the personal dimension of each of your presentations. I'd like to ask each of you a question, and then we'll open up for conversation. My first question is to you, Sara. Are there any circumstances whatsoever where you can imagine or support the possibility of an Israeli withdrawal from most of Judea and Samaria, part of Judea and Samaria?
No. No, this is our homeland. This is our homeland. You don't need to be religious in order to understand that this is our homeland. You don't need to be religious in order to understand that we're here in the land of Israel, in this jungle of Middle East, and not in Uganda. There's a reason why we came here. There's a reason, and the reason is also Tel Aviv, but it's also Bethel and Hebron. And if you live your values and your beliefs and your tradition, well, you're rabbis, you know the value of tradition. So if you live it, you won't survive, especially not in the Middle East, especially not in a complex reality. And we won't give our homes. It's our home. It's our physical home. It's our spiritual home. Now, I'm not ignoring the complexity. I'm not ignoring the fact that there are many Palestinians, many Arabs in this land. But I believe we can fit complex solutions to complex reality.
Thank you. Oded, you presented yourself, or really as, in a way, the spokesman of the more pragmatic elements within the settlement movement, those who came for, as you say, frankly, for quality of life. What one often hears in the settlement movement is that there is no such thing as a Palestinian people, and there is no such thing as an occupation. How do you relate to those ideas?
How much time have we got? 3 minutes. Wow. It's impossible. I can't. there are Palestinian people. They're my neighbors. I meet them on a weekly basis. I share their Sara. I celebrate with them their excitement. And we try and help one another to get what we need. I think the tragedy of the conflict at the end of the day is the fact that there are leaders who don't take into account the need of both people. I think the tragedy of the conflict is the fact that the agenda is dedicated, driven, written, and attended by the extreme, loud, small minority. I don't think it's unique to us. I think it's happening everywhere in the world. I think that if we would have targeted the vast, sane, silent majority, agreements would have been reached. I think the fact that we had two prime ministers, Ehud Barak and Ehud Olmert, offering between 92 to 96% of the land, and in the last few months we've discovered that Netanyahu was negotiating over almost 100%, and the answer was always no, is an indication of how there's no maneuver for those compromises that you're trying to indicate. The fact that the PLO was established in 1964, prior to the day that there was even one settlement, raises a lot of questions as to what are their demands, what are they asking for. And I think in order to make you even more puzzled where I'm driving to, I think for years we've been pulled by two major vectors. One vector was trying to justify who has got a better title, who derives on a stronger promise, on a stronger agreement, on a stronger treaty, on a stronger international resolution, who goes all the way back to the Bible. Depending on your level of history, the level of your belief, you will go as far as you want. That's one major vector. The other major vector is the argument of a one state or a two state. And whilst being pulled by these two vectors, not reaching any agreement on either one of these, we've been ignoring the reality. We've been ignoring the needs of people, which I presume you're all extremely aware of, the lack of infrastructure, the poverty, a lot of things which hurt me as a human being without any belief, without any agenda, just to see how my neighbors live. But when you see, and we'll just end with that, the current news from Gaza, what the electricity is being used for, the fact that Abu Mazen is finally showing some action of a leader and saying he's not going to pay the electricity bills for Gaza because they're misusing the electricity for not civil purposes but for military purposes. And just to understand how complex this region is, which Sara was trying to explain to you, my Palestinian neighbors are extremely upset at the moment because they say finally Abu Mazen is showing some sort of leadership, and we have the Egyptians coming and interfering and paying the electricity bill so Hamas can have electricity again. Just understand how crazy the reality is. And the worst sanction, whilst there was no electricity, was that Israel was under attack of sewage. Israel was building dirt piles in order to stop the sewage from flowing over from Gaza to Ashkelon. That's how crazy the reality is. Are those issues which can't be resolved? They can be resolved in a second. There just needs to be an interest and desire on both parties to reach agreements, to reach compromises. And if the leaders won't do it, and I think that's what Yaakov is trying to indicate, I think that's what I'm trying to do in Efrat, is try and build those local bridges, which are harder to build, harder to maintain. Once we complete them, they're much stronger than any fence that you raise. But we are fighting against extremists who do everything in their power to kill normality. Thank you.
Thank you. Yaakov, you spoke very movingly about your interfaith efforts with your neighbors, but it's happening in a context in which we're over here and your neighbors are over here. Do you envision a time when your neighbors will enjoy the same rights that you do?
I guess you're probably asking what a future vision. I think talking about the past is so difficult because there's such different narratives. I feel that a vision of the future is much easier to get to a connection. I think Einstein once defined insanity as trying to do the same thing again and again and get different results. I think at the heart of the two-state solution, which knowing the people who live here, and I know the spectrum of Palestinian society. I've been a number of times in PLO headquarters in Ramallah. I know the Salafis from Hebron who think that the whole PA are a bunch of heretics. Is that as one sheikh put it, the problem of Oslo is to see what is mine is not yours. What is yours is not mine. There's a zero-sum game, which in a Western secular view, if we're dealing with natural resources, we could somehow find some way to divide things up. But when we're talking about issues that are connected to our deepest identities, both for the Jews and Israelis and for the Muslims and the Palestinians, the ability to treat it as some sort of natural resource makes it much more complicated, and we see the results that it hasn't worked. Somehow, as Sara has mentioned earlier, there has to be some approach to break out of the zero-sum game, to find some way to balance the advantages and disadvantages of a one- and two-state solution. Since I have limited time, but if anyone's interested, in the Times of Israel, I have an article called The Abrahamic Union, joining what's within a new voice looking for confederate solutions that would evolve, and I'll stress the word evolve, into a situation of two states, but not disconnected, but connected, to allow people to live where they are and find a place of connection that we all feel part of based on our shared identities. If France and Germany are separate countries, but they're part of a broader identity of the European Union, I think a confederation could deal with issues of essence for both sides and bring new thinking on the issue. But one thing which I think is critical, and with this I will end, I think the essence, we need a bottom-up solution and not a top-down. The assumption in Oslo is that the leaders would get some sort of agreement and somehow that would make better fences, better neighbors. The reality has told us otherwise. Because of the disconnection between our societies, that number one, doesn't allow to get to an agreement. Number two, even if agreement would be reached, if there's disconnect between the societies, it would just lead to, in my opinion, a worse situation, as what happened after the leaving of Gaza. And number three, better connections could allow new solutions to take place. So what we need now is enormous energy in a bottom-up solution of finding ways to stop negativities, incitement in different areas, and find more bridges and connections. And I'll mention that Efrat, I'm surprised you didn't mention it, it's been such, in so many areas there's a healthcare in the different clinics there, and there are many initiatives taking place in the Gush Etzion Efrat area. And with that, I'll.
Thank you. And now let's open up for questions. Someone going around with a mic? Anyone from the Machon who wants to volunteer, go around and circulate? Thank you.
Who am I going to, Yossi? On that last point, Rabbi, you raised the point that I was going to ask about. I was here a few months ago and met with a number of groups, all of whom were bottom-up. An example would be the Yad B'Yad schools, but there were other opportunities. It just seems like such a almost impossible ideal to try and get grouping. So is there a way forward like that? It seems to me to be the most plausible way to achieve peace. But how do you get millions of people in line with that? And are you seeing possibilities where people are just so fed up with the violence and the threats to their lives that they say, "Nimasli, I just need to do something about this"? Those are the kinds of groups we met with. But we met with 10 groups in a week, and represented maybe hundreds of people, but not millions.
Okay. Well, first of all, even if you look just at the organizations, since I've been on the scene for many years, I think there's exponential growth in these areas. Even just one of the organizations I'm involved with, the Interfaith Encounter, has 50 groups of Jews and Arabs that each of the 50 groups meet on a regular basis. I mentioned one is Settlers in Hebron, with leaders of different Chamulot in Hebron, that including Noam Arnon, the spokesperson of Hebron. I've been to iftars in the heart of Hebron with him. But I think in terms of the public discourse, this is becoming much more known. There are a number of documentaries that just came out right now on this issue. One about a Palestinian-owned field in Gush Etzion, which is kind of center for Jewish settler-Palestinian connection. Another near Bar'am, in wake of his book and articles about being on the Green Line, which he dedicated a year. The movie just came out. So I feel, and another critical issue, and I think this is when you're close, things look very different than far away. And from afar, you see what's news. News is generally violence, but I think John Lennon has some sort of song that life is what happens when you're planning the next thing. I rephrase it as life is what happens between the news. And if you look at what happens between the news, you get a very different perspective. If you go to the Rami Levi at Tzomet HaGush, the Jews and Israelis, Palestinians buying together, in the staff together, and just the day-to-day life is, all the bad things are true, but the totality of life has so many other things that just are under the orbit and radar of people from the West and people from the outside.
This man.
Hi, my name is Neil. I have a question for Sara. And first of all, thank you so much for being here, and to everybody. And I ask this question with deepest respect. But Kiryat Arba is a place that has prominent memorials to Meir Kahane and to Baruch Goldstein. And my question is, does that bother you? And how do you speak to your children about the legacy of these men?
I'm so happy you asked this. I'm so happy. Because the story of Baruch Goldstein, who was a doctor, he treated me when I was a baby. But it's horrible what he did. And the story of his graveyard in Kiryat Arba, have you been there? Okay. So there's a big graveyard where he was buried. And when he murdered the prayers in Hebron, so afterwards the family wanted to, they killed him to stop shooting or whatever, just revenge, I don't know. And the family wanted to bury him in the ancient cemetery in Hebron. And then the Palestinians said, we will never accept it, that someone who murdered us will be buried among us. And it could have led to an enormous terror incident. And so this is the story. And then they said, okay, where can we bury him? Let's bury him inside the fence. We have a fence in Kiryat Arba. And so they buried him there. And here's the story of this place. It was a flourishing place. There was a fuel gas station, and it was a main, there was a small shopping center, no Walmarts, but very small. And there was, the whole area was of festivals, art festivals, celebrations of some events. And ever since he buried there, it became the backyard of Kiryat Arba. You cannot find today, you cannot find them, there are no celebrations, no festivals, nothing, just whores, alcohol, drugs. This is the backyard of Kiryat Arba. Now, there are some people who glorify this guy. There are a few of them. Most of the population of Kiryat Arba either don't know who he was, they don't really care about it. I mean, it was, 20 years ago. Or either condemn it and get disgust from it. So I know that in left organizations, towards it's the first station. And then when they come with breaking the silence, for instance, so all the extremists that that celebrate Baruch Goldstein and glorify him, they come there and they say, no, he's a hero, and you're traitors, and they love it. They're extreme. I mean, this is their air. This is what they live for. But that's not reality. That's not reality. The reality is that he was buried there out of this is not was the first choice, and it became the backyard of Kiryat Arba. That's the reality. He's not a hero in Kiryat Arba.
My name is David. I'm over here on the side. My question, I think, is for Sara, although I'm happy for anyone to answer. But I wanted to ask you, I thought of you, Sara, because you were talking about tradition and values. So my understanding is that visiting a place like Beit Zakaria, which is a Palestinian village in Area C that's surrounded by Alon Shvut and Gush Etzion, and that it's extremely difficult for those villages to get permits to have natural evolving building in natural ways, so expanding homes for larger families, where families have been rejected over and over 5-6 times trying to get permits to build within their communities, and they're surrounded by Israeli settlements that are multiplying and building yeshivot and synagogues. And so my question is, what kind of work are you doing to advocate for those families to be able to live, in ways that we would suggest are basic, the needs for basic people?
I'm going to ask Oded to answer that question.
It's a relatively simple question for me, because when Jason Greenblatt came to Israel the first time as the special envoy of the president, that's exactly what I told him. I told him if there is pressure and the American administration want to allow building in Area C, the way to do it is to try and create some sort of mirror, some sort of mechanism that both populations can enjoy it. What I mean is, just like you are describing the problems of Beit Zakaria, which, by the way, I'll just open brackets, prior to 1967, there were 4 Arab villages which were attached to running water. Today, there are 97% of the population which is attached to running water. Okay, the infrastructure has improved tremendously, but there's a lot more to do. And Beit Zakaria is an example, and Area C is an example. We have to remember that areas A, B, and C were something that were supposed to be completely temporary to lead to a Palestinian state. It never reached that situation. for endless reasons. I don't want to go to the history because that's one of the vectors that we get pulled back. But what I am saying is, yes, let's try and solve domestic issues for both populations and use that as tool to empower the different parts. Now, I spoke with Jason about that. I'm speaking with all the IDF generals who are relevant to that. There is some sort of ceiling which I'm not managing to break at the moment, which is the politicians. They're extremely afraid, and you have the Minister of Defense who is using now the carrot and stick strategy, but even he is afraid of what he's doing, and he's not doing it, as far as I'm concerned, in a complete way. Because he doesn't, if he wanted to give 15,000 units in Kalkilia, okay, because there are needs of Kalkilia to develop, and there are people within our camp that condemn it and are against it, I'm willing to accept it. I'm willing to accept it, but I need to understand what's the outcome of it. What's the outcome? Because if you want to start changing the atmosphere, and if you want to start changing the approach, there needs to be a give and take discussion to see where we're leading to. Okay, and just to answer your question about what can be done in a massive scale, so I was supposed to meet Sheldon Edelson last week. He was in Israel, and the meeting got canceled in the last minute. But I've prepared from him a proposal to teach every Israeli kid in school Arabic. Okay, that's a bottom up, but the reality will come from the bottom up. Okay, it will be funded by the government. It will be funded by a multimillionaire person. Why? Because I have a kid in 3rd grade who went to the supermarket in Efrat. And he comes the following day to the teacher and he says to her, listen, I've heard 2 Arabs talking in the supermarket. And I want you to hear what they said. And she was getting all excited. She thought he's going to bring us some extremely important piece of intelligence information. So she went and got a piece of paper and a pen to write down what he said. And he came back and he said they were talking how red the tomatoes are in the supermarket. You're laughing, I was crying, because just imagine how much fear that kid could have had without understanding the reality. Bet Zecharia is an excellent example because all the residents of Bet Zecharia actually work in the JCC in Gush Etzion. So the people know them. They have a dentist clinic there where Jews go and get treated. But I can't help him with building permits because it's not in my jurisdiction. And that's the ceiling that I'm trying to break, because they are entitled and they should be able to build just like I want to build. And the reality that I see in the future is there are people here on both sides. We're not ignoring anybody. Nobody's going anywhere. Let's find a way how we can live one alongside the other. And just one last piece of information, which I think is also important. All the settlements, all the roads leading to the settlements, all the land which is zoned for further expansion of the settlements is 1.6% of Judea and Samaria. 1.6%. I'm not talking about areas A, B, and C. I'm actually talking just on the footprint of all the Jewish settlements. 84% of them are built west of the security fence. So just get things a bit in proportion and just understand basically how much potential there is still with the playground to play around with.
We've heard from a number of men. I'd like to invite any of the women here who would like to ask a question or to make a comment. Women?
Excuse me, just one moment, please.
I'd also like a short response. I feel a lot of what keeps everything so dysfunctional is that both sides have bargaining chips. And neither side wants to give up any bargaining chip, even though it's not really helping them, but it's their leverage. Meaning, everybody knows that there are different areas, even within a two-state solution, that will be part of Israel, or the Jews will be living there. But nevertheless, it's a bargaining chip for the PA not to acknowledge that, and every house or whatnot is a big issue. In the same way, the Israeli side feel we also have our bargaining chips, and therefore we won't give building permits in all these areas, which would seem to be totally natural to expand it. I feel that we have to change the dialogue to say, both sides, just give up some of your bargaining chips. Give up these things that you're holding each other, you're taking the energy and the humanity out of both sides. Just time has come for both sides to give up some of their bargaining chips, to accept some of the future realities, and make things livable much more for both sides.
Hi. So I'm wondering, what do you think about the issue of civil rights for the Palestinians who live on the West Bank in Judea, Samaria? I'm personally, that's one of my concerns, including the different rights under different applications of the law. And one of the ways to go with that is a two-state solution. I mean, you've all indicated that that's not the way you want to go, but where do you want to go with that? Do you intend to maintain that population with without access to civil rights, or what else do you have to say?
I think that the only solution we already tried is a two-state solution. We actually tried it before the State of Israel was founded, because in 1947, when the UN decided or offered to split this land into two states, a Jewish state and an Arab state, the Jews said yes, and the Arabs opened in a war. So, and we tried it. And we tried it, and the PLO, as Oded said, was founded in 1964. Before there was an occupation, not even one settlement. So, and we tried it in the Oslo agreements, the Oslo Accords, and it led to bloods in the streets. The buses were exploding in the middle of Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. And we actually tried in 2005. We did everything that was expected from us, everything. We uprooted graves from the land. We reburied these. And there is no Palestinian state in Gaza. It could have been the Singapore of the Middle East. It's not. It's a horrible place. I feel so bad, I really do. In the humanitarian level, it's horrible. And I know that if you'll start with civil rights, and we will go straight inside the wall. We will never succeed to get into some solution if we'll start on this. And I want a process. I don't want the situation to stay like it today. And I believe that if we'll think differently, because we tried, for 40 years we tried the two-state solution. For 20 years in negotiation, and before that in different organizations. And I believe that even not now, okay, nothing will happen now. Okay, let's begin with this. Nothing now and nothing tomorrow. We're in the Middle East, not Switzerland. Few hours from here, there's a civil war and kids being slaughtered. It's hours. It's like going from New York to Washington. It's very tiny. So we're in the middle of a storm. We cannot do anything now. Nothing will happen now. Nothing will happen tomorrow. But I do want to believe that in 50 years, 60 years, 100 years, that in historical perspective, it's nothing. What's 50 years in historical perspective? We can find a creative solution, maybe with Jordan, maybe with the area here in the Middle East, not only here, the small Israel. We can find something creative. We need to open our mind and think about different solutions.
I would like to add a few points to your question. Number one, if that's the impression you got from me, so I'm sorry. I have as many problems with the two-state solution as I have with the one-state solution. I understand that if we're going for a one-state solution, we have to address the Jewish majority issue, and I understand that in the world that we live in today, you can't have citizens who don't have full rights. I understand that. I understand that the implication is that we might wake one morning and have a defense minister who is an Arab, and I don't think most Israelis want to see that reality. I think, again, as I said, arguing about the two-state or the one-state solution, we've tried it, we've been there, I won't repeat what Sara said. But what I do want you to know is, I had once a visit of a Reform rabbi from San Francisco, a very well-known Reform rabbi from San Francisco. He's a friend of my parents for many years. I visited him in San Francisco, and I said to him, next time you're in Israel, I want you to come to Efrat. And he said, you know, I can't. If I will come, I'll use all my positions as chairman of all the organizations that I had. And he took a risk. My father picked him up from the hotel, and he drove him to Efrat, and I took him to Wadi Nis, one of the 3 neighboring villages. He was extremely surprised that we go into Wadi Nis unescorted, unarmed, unprotected, just the 3 of us in my car. And we come to Wadi Nis, and he says to them, I don't understand. After you've said how much cooperation you have with the city of Efrat, how much trust you have with the leadership of Efrat, how much you trust the people of Efrat more than what you trust the Palestinian Authority, why have I never heard it before? Why don't you speak out your minds? And they were answering him, and I was the translator, and I obviously didn't do a good job because he didn't understand them and they didn't understand him. They said to him, excuse us, Rabbi, but this is not San Francisco. You can't say what you want, when you want, about what you want, to whoever you want, because if you do so, there's sanctions. We can't even vote for who we want, because once in every 12 years when we have elections, when the Palestinian Authority can actually guarantee that they know what will be the results, we can't vote what we want, because if the village doesn't vote according to what we're being instructed, there'll be sanctions. Your question comes from a world of values that we share, we understand. Unfortunately, sadly for us, that's not the world they live in. I had a visit of a group called V15. If you've heard of them, you've heard of them. If you didn't, they advocate for a two-state solution. They became L15 because they lost in the elections of 2015, and they come and say to me, Oded, we want to come and visit you, to shoot at you our arguments, and see your response, so we'll be better prepared for the next time. And I prepared myself as well. I brought a few of my neighbors from the Arab villages. One of them said a sentence that he deserves copyright on. He said to them the following: you Israelis, your democracy has put behind bars a prime minister and a president. Our president has put behind bars democracy. What? It's not funny. And he said, I don't want to be part of my democracy, I want to be part of your democracy. What's the Oslo Accord? It's an attempt to build a Palestinian state. They have a president. They have elected systems. They have a judicial system, they have a court system, they have a police system. It's dysfunctional. Don't ask me, ask Professor Shkaki, the only reliable surveyor within the Palestinian Authority. He will tell you how much lack of trust there is in the Palestinian Authority. And we have to deal with that. And even when we disconnect like we did in Gaza, we have to deal with that because, yes, natural resources are so close and so proximity that there's no way to avoid it. And we need to reach these agreements. So that's where we are, but we're trying to do the best out of it.
I think one of the one point which I would like to mention, because I think many American Jews who so strongly identified with the civil rights movement in America, they frame the situation here as in the issues of blacks and whites in the 60s in the United States. And the part of the problem with that issue, with that connection, first I'll mention, as in my article of my idea of the idea of the confederations, ultimately certainly equal rights I've detailed that, but in the interim, In the interim, we're not in a country with a minority and majority. There is a conflict here. We can't ignore some people say the problem is the occupation. I feel the problem is there's a conflict. There's a conflict between two people. We could debate to what extent each one is responsible for it, for what extent each side is suffering, to what side each has rights to the land. But in the current situation, there is a conflict between two sides, a violent conflict, and to frame this in the issues of the civil rights movement of the United States in the 60s, I think is very misleading, and I think this is a shift of understanding which I think is important for many of us.
We have time for one last question.
Hi, I was also on the Breaking the Silence trip, and thank you all so much for being here and giving me an opportunity to see the other side. I would love to know any of your opinions, but specifically you, Sara, if you have thoughts on the immense amount of resources that the State of Israel and the IDF spend, a ratio of 1-to-1 soldier, protecting the settlers in the West Bank, specifically Hebron.
It's not a business. I mean, we're not in a business where we earn or lose money. Or, of course, there are thoughts about how it costs and, the costs in terms of not only money, right? And if it's needed, so we'll be there. And if it's needed to put forces, IDF forces, at the border of Gaza, and if it's needed to get inside there once in, few years, so we'll do it. If we need to secure our people, we'll do it. This is what the IDF for.
I think the question comes from a place of not really understanding the reality. Because the soldiers, at the end of the day, are not just protecting the settlers there. Jerusalem, as Ben Gurion said, in the War of Independence, managed to stay safe because of the fact that there was Gush Etzion there. Efrat has no barrier, and the security fence is not completed by Efrat. And it's not a motorway for suicide bombers. Why? Because of two reasons. The IDF is doing its job and going into villages to try and find those who want to do terrorist attacks. But there are also the Palestinian efforts which are also trying to eliminate it because they understand that it doesn't project well in their PR relationship. But the whole security structure of the Israeli society is based on the fact that the IDF is where it needs to be in order to protect the people of Tel Aviv. The missiles from Gaza were flying over not to Judea and Samaria, they were flying over to Sderot, to Tel Aviv, and the IDF went into Gaza not to protect Judea and Samaria, but to protect the people of Tel Aviv. And we're all the same population. But just to understand how much the Israeli society wants to save on spending money on security, if any of you have heard about the issue that happened on Sukkot, where there were 4 Palestinians arrested, it was in my backyard. It was in my house. And in the Sukkah, there were 30 Palestinians, there were 80 Israelis. The local policeman and the local police officer also asked their superior commanders to come, and at the end of the day, there were a delegation of 30 officers led by a general from the IDF and an equivalent rank from the police. The general came for 5 minutes, he stayed over an hour and a half. He was the last person to speak in the Sukkah. And he said something, again, just one sentence, because he didn't want to get involved in politics. But he said, the more social gatherings like this will happen, the less the state of Israel will have to invest in security. This is happening in Judea and Samaria, in the disputed territories, in the conflict zone, in the battle zone. Social gathering will save money. The tragedy of that meeting was that the Palestinians got so excited, they took selfies, they put them up on Facebook. The Palestinian Authority couldn't uphold having a picture of somebody having coffee with an Israeli general and smiling, and they were arrested for 4.5 days under the accusation that they were negotiating peace with the Zionist enemy without being authorized to do so. You're laughing, I was crying for 4.5 days. You can just imagine what a guilt conscience I had of having coffee with my neighbors and they ending up in an interrogation room. It took us 4.5 days, 3 American congressmen who read my Facebook posts and said, how can we help you? None of those human rights organizations, Red Cross, United Nations, none of them were available to help me. 3 American congressmen, $15,000 bribery money that we had to pay to get them out. The following day, the first meeting they have is with who? With me. I prepared printouts of all the media coverage that I managed to do to get the whole world know that this is why my neighbors were arrested. So that we don't have any hard feelings about you. We know who are the good guys, who is caring about us, and who doesn't give anything about us. But we are afraid. We are afraid, and we need to keep our heads underneath the table. That's the tragedy of the conflict. And if we manage to empower the large, vast, sane majority, there is a future to create a change. Thank you.
So one of the differences in the discourse in large parts of the American Jewish community and the discourse here in Israel is that the conversation we've just heard is entirely mainstream here. And settlers are not other in Israeli society. They are very much integrated into who we are as a society, into Israeli identity and reality. When I speak to American Jewish groups, I urge them to step out of their Israel comfort zone and experience that part of Israel that they may not know and may not really want to experience. And so when I speak, for example, to Orthodox American Jews, I urge them on their next trip to Israel to include a visit to an Arab Israeli village, along with going to Hebron and Gush Etzion. When I speak to liberal Jewish groups, I urge them to go to Gush Etzion. And I know you'll be very happy to host. And so I want to thank our panelists for coming, for presenting, and for sharing with us some of their deepest thoughts and emotions. And I'd like to thank all of you for coming and for participating in a conversation that I hope was expansive. Thank you very much.